Oh, gosh, an expectant hush, which is just as well absolutely on the second, which we have to do nowadays because half our audience, or even more, I suspect, is watching us remotely, and welcome to them and a very, very warm welcome to you. Sort of looking round, the problem of going online, the problem since COVID is these events become terribly depleted. Just at the time you can suddenly embrace somebody and say, hey, hi, they're not there, or at least they are there. For those of you who are watching online, incidentally, look what you're missing behind. You should have been here. A special welcome to Ralph Tomlinson, the Director of Quality Improvement at the Royal College of Surgeons. For those of you who were at this event last year, I'm not going to go through it again. I was just praising the RCS to the skies because of the extraordinary amount of evidence-based medicine, evidence-based surgery that they are doing, leading the world, and I'm afraid leading the Royal College of Physicians and all the other Royal Colleges in just their dedication to evidence-based science. And Ralph's been a significant part of that. And indeed, welcome to HealthSense as opposed to HealthWatch. Our big change of name, because I can't think who, but somebody snaffled our last name and ran away with it. And also welcome the first time we've had awards which have been separated from the AGM, which I think is a very, very good thing. And so our guests don't have to sit through the boring routines of going through the minutes of the last meeting and all the rest of it. It means we can get straight to it. Firstly, I want to give you a reminder, particularly for those who are watching online, because I think everybody here already knows why we have these awards. The NHS in England alone consumes something like £140 billion a year. Between 1995 and 1920, its share of the total government expenditure went from 7.7% to 18.5%. And it's now close to 20%, and it's rising inexorably and inexorably. We have a duty to make sure that what we spend that money on actually works. It's really, really important. Politicians keep talking about changing the furniture, rearranging the furniture in the NHS, but much, much more fundamental, the biggest priority is to make sure that every pound we spent is spent wisely. And that means we need to know what works, we need to know what doesn't work, and we need to understand that the history of medicine is filled with shocking failure of knowledge or even caring about what works. And I think it's probably fair to say that for millennia, doctors killed at least as many people as they cured. And that is something it's easy to gloss over and forget, but it's fundamentally important. And if you're going to do anything on another person, which is akin to assault, frankly, it's really fundamental that you know how it works. And yet, we don't, often. HealthWatch was born to tackle pseudoscience, the conspiracy theories, the downright voodoo that human beings find so persuasive. Yet amazingly, some 4 centuries after the so-called Age of Enlightenment, the Age of Reason was supposed to have taken over the Western world at least, we still have conspiracy theories, but actually we still have a lot of qualified doctors, nurses, dentists, and all sorts of other people in the allied health professionals who really don't know what good evidence is. They're really, really challenged about it. So why, in this age of evidence-based medicine, do we still have midwives, nurses, not taught at all about evidence-based medicine? And I had some correspondence with the RCS, such boring correspondence with the RCS, who said there are so many things that we have to teach midwives, so many things we have to teach nurses, that actually you can't expect them to understand evidence and science and to be able to appraise what really works on top of it. It is actually a policy that they don't teach it. With medical schools, it's a bit here and a bit there. So you can go to some places like Oxford where you're not allowed to see a patient until you've been a consultant for 10 years. And in other places, you're not allowed to learn any science at all until you've been a consultant for 10 years. Even then, you're pretty lucky. So hence, the RCS HealthSense Prize. And this is for students who can tell the wheat from the chaff, who can tell the cures from the bullshit. And I'm not going to go on again about how much importance I attach to this, but I attach such enormous importance to these students who have gone into the methodology, who do have got themselves into a position when they are in practice are really going to be able to help patients rather than just follow received wisdom. Now, tonight we can celebrate 3 students who've excelled in this, 2 runners-up and 1 absolute winner. Of the runners-up, one is a sort of winner anyway in my books because he almost came top last year. He's studying at King's College London. Will you please congratulate, for the 2nd year running, Jack Coombe. But you're going to get a whole collection of these now. Yeah. Jack, I just want you to say, why did you do it and why is it important to you?
So I'm quite interested in research, so developing these skills is a real opportunity to kind of assess things later on in life, especially with regards to research. So having this competition is a great opportunity to put those skills into practice, so that's why.
Do you promise you're going to do this again next year and win next year?
We'll see. 3rd time lucky. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much indeed. Our second runner-up is going to need her medical appraisal skills because she plans to go into research. She's at UCL. She's in her 3rd year. She's already got her sights firmly set on going from one part of UCL to another, to Queen Square. She wants to be either a neuroscientist or a neurologist. So sign her up, incidentally, for the RCS pretty quickly. While you've got her here. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please congratulate Honey Panchal. Congratulations. Well done. And again, honey, just tell us what made you go in for this?
I think, obviously, like it was already mentioned, research is a really, really important part of what I want to do in the future. And I already do some research, and I feel like doing this kind of gave me a more appreciation for how research should be carried out. And I hope to integrate that into whatever I do in the future.
Well done. Congratulations, honey. Thank you very, very much. Now, the first prize, and firstly this year, I ought to say this is a clean sweep for the London medical schools, and in particular for King's. What is it that they're doing at KCL that is right? But they're obviously doing something right. To be fair, this person has had some unfair advantages, you might say. It just turned out that her GP tutor, while she was being an undergraduate, was a former chair of HealthSense, one Mr. James or Dr. James May. She's now completed her degree. She's heading off for her 1st year in practice, her foundation year. I believe as a psychiatrist, I'm going to ask her that away, but tucked her under a belt, she is now the winner of the 2022 HealthSense Award. Lydia, come on up, Lydia Shackshaft, I'm sorry. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Now, tell us, was it James that inspired you, or were you already really into this stuff anyway? Is KCL actually, it really pushes you into this stuff?
No, definitely not. So I'm happy that there's 2 of us from King's here. No, I started learning more about critical appraisal when I was preparing for academic foundation programme interviews and realised that King's and med school hadn't taught me all that much. So this seemed like a good opportunity to practice, keep learning, and sort of be ready to actually use evidence in my practice. King's tells us about evidence-based medicine, but I think uses it as a little bit of a buzzword. I don't know if you'd agree, but it doesn't teach us how to actually appraise the evidence and use it. So it seems like an opportunity.
When you're a consultant,
yes,
and when you're a professor, are you going to be able to change the syllabus, or is it just there are so many things to learn that actually, science, we can't get into that?
I hope we can change it. I know that medical schools, like you said, they always say there's already so much in the curriculum, there's already too much to do, we can't fit anything else in. But I think it does have to change because medicine is constantly changing and we need to understand how to actually use the evidence and change our practice. So I hope I can help change it, maybe.
Good on you. Good luck. Well
Thank
done.
you.
Thank you very much, Lydia. Well, can you have a bigger one than winning that? Yeah, well, I suppose this 4th one is the big one because it is the HealthSense Award for 2022. you'll know that award ceremonies are a bit like funerals, really, where what you get is a eulogy. You don't get a proper assessment. You don't get anybody being critical. You certainly don't get insults. You get flattery, even obsequiousness. The truth is, for our winner next year, it's pretty hard to find anything nasty to say, even if you'd wanted to. I've had a career in broadcasting, as many of you know. I've met presidents, prime ministers, A-listers from Hollywood. So it takes a lot to make me starstruck, but I am starstruck, always have been, by this year's winner of the 2022 award. It's not so much for her achievements, which many of you will know have been listed all over the place, not least Chief Scientific Advisor, of course, Chief Medical Officer, Executive Member of the WHO. But this recognises her and thanks her for her absolute commitment to what we've been talking about, to evidence-based medicine, for speaking up for evidence-based medicine, for championing evidence-based medicine, and somehow persuading those with more power than she did to set up the NIHR, an extraordinary achievement, the National Institute of Health Research, part of the NHS, which now has persuaded the government to give it well over £1 billion a year for real, serious, hefty research into evidence-based medicine. She's also, and my son who's sitting over here can testify, since she's worked for her briefly during one of his remarkably many medical fellowships, she's not just prescient and outspoken and an inspiring leader, she's actually really nice. People like working for her, which is, again, I told you this was going to be a bit like a funeral, a bit like a eulogy, because it's very hard not to go into this. And of course, it's not just the UK. One of her perhaps greatest campaigns is as global leader with the UN on microbial resistance. Microbial resistance is, antimicrobial resistance, I should say, is not just about microbes in the sense of bacteria, which I always thought it was. But if you read any of the UN stuff, it's remarkable how widely it now goes, including, of course, fungi and viruses, about which we know about resistance rather to our cost over the last few years. We all know it's a huge and challenging problem. I say we all know, not everybody. Of course, our last Secretary of Health, Therese Coffey, so she gives her leftover antibiotics to her friends. So there is still a little bit of education for her to do. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please welcome and will you congratulate Professor Dame Sally Davies. Sally. Which I must do on camera because the camera can only look. This is for you. For you to
thank you.
Examine that afterwards. But Sally, thank you so much, and I think you're going to speak to us.
I believe so, yes.
Without notes?
Well, no, I have got some notes.
I was terribly impressed.
I can do it without notes, but I can talk the hind leg off the donkey, as we all know. Thank you. I'm extraordinarily honoured. I have watched Health Watch with great pleasure, what you do, how you support evidence-based medicine, and to me, that's important. And when I look at the previous awardees, I am in good company of amazing people, many of whom are friends, so thank you. So I did wonder whether I should talk about evidence-based medicine, because I did dream up the NIHR, I did persuade ministers to let me set it up, and by the time I'd run it for 10 years, the budget was 1.25 billion as I handed it over to Chris Whitty. And I think it has changed evidence-based medicine in many ways. I could have talked about being a Cochrane editor and writing reviews and how I believe in meta-analysis and everything. But actually, I thought you might find it more interesting for me to talk as the UK's Special Envoy on Antimicrobial Resistance and as a member of the United Nations Global Leaders Group on AMR. So let's start with AMR. What is it? You heard. It's Darwinian natural selection of infective organisms, whether they're bacteria, viruses, parasites, fungi. When they meet their treatments, the mutations happen and they can proliferate. And it really is becoming a big problem. So if I start with my journey, one of the pleasures of being Chief Medical Officer is writing an annual report. And I did it differently from my predecessors. I thought we'd have them evidence-based, actually. So I brought in the experts on a subject I chose. My first was infection. I thought that'd be a good one to try. Community, secondary care, tertiary care, and I didn't think there was anything kind of difficult in there. And I'd try out my way of choosing the subject, getting the experts to write the chapters, saying what to me, but not in their chapters, what they thought should be the policy implications, and then I would write the policy implications. And when they came back and I read all these chapters and we had our final meeting, it was quite clear that since I'd stopped seeing patients in 2006, antimicrobial resistance in bacteria in particular had risen steadily, and yet the medicine chest and the pipeline was empty of new drugs. So this, we now talk about it being a silent, insidious pandemic. And I decided, because people weren't working on this and focusing on it, that I'd better give the problem voice. And so I did the Ebola response, I did Novichok, I mean, I was in part responsible for the sugar levy for obesity, I did a report on obesity, all sorts of things. But this is the thing that I kept on, and I now do 50% of my life on it. Actually, I think the UK is doing pretty well on what we're doing. Our One Health Action Plan is being updated at the moment. I am chivying to try and make sure it's stretching and we do well. The EU does very well at a policy level. They've just banned the use of antibiotics as growth promoters, not only for food-producing animals and the food chain in Europe, but for imports. And I'm very pro-EU, and they're vital in the leadership about AMR. And I would argue that sorting this has never been more important than now, because we knew that it mattered. I went to David Cameron when he was PM and said, we have to look at the economic impact. I persuaded him to commission Jim O'Neill, who did look at the economic impact for us. And by 2050, if we don't take action, we'll see 10 million deaths a year around the globe, and it'll cost trillions. But people sat up and engaged a bit, but they didn't really understand it. What COVID has shown everyone is not only do infections maim and kill, but they ruin your economies as well. And frankly, AMR's on the way to doing that. And you have to remember, COVID won't be the last pandemic. There'll be flu pandemics. What did most people in 2018 die of in flu? They died of bacterial infections. And if we've got AMR, if we've got untreatable bacteria, then they're going to die. So, you know, we need to make sure we have an effective way of preventing, that means infection prevention and control, vaccines, of treating, of diagnosing and treating. With a lot of pressure from me, earlier this year, we got the world's first comprehensive estimates of the global burden of AMR to date. They were done as a partnership between Oxford University and the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation in Seattle, who do the global burden of disease. And the director of that, Chris Murray, rang me up and said, Sally, now I understand why you wanted me to do this. It's dreadful. It's seriously a big problem. And I said, oh, bother. I was rather hoping that you'd find it wasn't, and that I'd been bleating on about this when I didn't need to. What did they show? Looking at 204 countries and 471 million individual health records, they showed that 1.27 million deaths in 2019 were attributable to antimicrobial resistance, and they looked only at bacteria and certain, I think they looked at 70 bacteria, drug combinations. So actually, that's far more than the HIV deaths, it's far more than TB or malaria. Yet because it doesn't have a face, people aren't really aware. Meanwhile, their data also shows it is now at nearly 5 million deaths a year, the most common underlying cause of death, the third most, actually, after heart disease and stroke. So it's terrifically important, but it doesn't have a face. The highest burden of AMR is, of course, and I'm talking generally about bacterial, but it holds true, we think, for fungal, viral, and parasites and everything, are beyond the borders of the global north, Europe and North America. They're in sub-Saharan Africa. But of course, just like COVID, we all bear the social and economic costs if we don't work together. And what you also have to understand, and I'll explain through a story of a study, of Swedish young students going off backpacking. Their guts were clean when they left. When they came back, and I think it was 23 of them, all but 2 had bugs in their gut, generally E. coli with AMR genes. We pick these up as we travel round, we carry them round, and they can give real problems when you come back. So when you hear about health and surgical tourism, one of our biggest concerns is what are they going to bring in? I remember a nasty burns, I think it was a nightclub that blew up in Romania, and they brought in flew in some of the victims into our burns units, and I had to insist that they went to only 1 or 2 burns units, because then we could kind of protect other burns units from whatever they brought in. So, but it's not just what's happening in humans. This year, we had a major study of over 250 rivers from more than 100 countries that showed over 1/4 of the rivers were polluted to toxic levels from antibiotic residues. Where do they come from? Well, they could come from manufacturing if that happens to be nearby. But of course, animals, we're animals, so is fish farming and the food chain, pee and poo out more than 80% of antibiotics. So they just run out. Some break down very quickly, but some sit around for years and years. And of course, if you think about the fact that over 80% of antibiotics go into the food chain animals as prophylaxis or for growth promotion around the world, think about the runoff into the water tables too. Most fish farming, they just, and this includes tiger prawns and things, I've stopped eating them, tip antibiotics in with the food into the water, and then they wash and clean the water out. Not the farmed salmon and trout from Norway and Scotland, they're vaccinated. So, Madrid was the most polluted river in Europe, ranking in the top 10% of global places with the highest cumulative concentrations. Glasgow was in the top 20% globally. So, we need data like this to help drive national, regional, and global action. And I've been pushing not only to understand the problem and take action, but for the evidence, the data. I think it's terrifically important. And we've really got to think about our interventions and our infrastructure. And I would argue that we're at risk of mortgaging the future of our planet by running both our medicines cabinet empty, toxifying the environment, and having this intensive farming without thinking through how to do it well. Purdue Poultry, which is one of the top 4 in the States, has taken antibiotics out by vaccination. They robotically vaccinate all the eggs, and then when they hatch, they spray, and it's red-coloured, vaccine on the chicks, and then they peck it off each other. So they're vaccinated. That's really good. So what are we going to do? How do we mobilise, and what do we need? Well, clearly we need R&D, and we make COVID vaccines really rapidly. The reason we could was they were built on earlier investment and research. But as it stands, most new antibiotics, even if they're made, don't reach most of the world. So of 25 new chemical entities developed between 1999 and 2014, only 12 had registered sales in more than 10 countries. So there we are. The countries that need them most are probably not getting them. Even Europe, many of the countries don't get novel antibiotics because registration in countries is far too costly. And if we want an antibiotic tomorrow, the ship sailed. It takes 20 years to make a new drug and get it into clinical practice, and only 5 of the 12 antibiotic companies that have gone public in the last decade are still active. Why is this happening? We have what's called a market failure. I remember explaining to David Cameron what market failure was in this context. It is that we pay extraordinarily little for antibiotics. No one wants to pay the amount that you pay, say, for a cancer drug. Yet they save lives as well. And they're not like anti-hypertension drugs or diabetes drugs, things that you take every day so you can have a tiny profit, but it'll build up because their patients are always on them. It's a non-viable market for the big companies, let alone for the small and medium enterprises who have 75% of these late-stage antibiotics in the pipeline that there are. And because of this limited funding, those SMEs channel most of their effort into discovering and developing new products, so they don't have money for commercialization, stewardship plans, and access plans. And access is very important if we want fairness and to protect everyone. An analysis of European public funding indicated 86% of national level funding for antibiotics was at basic research, leaving this big gap for the SMEs on developing treatments and getting them through. As a matter of fact, the WHO has remarked that the world is falling on AMR, with me pleading with them to do more. And I used the opportunity of the G7 presidency to really lay it out to our health ministers and the EU Commissioner. And Sunak, as finance minister, took this issue into the finance track for the first time ever, and the finance ministers made commitments on AMR for the first time, emphasising the role of pull incentives that can be piloted across economies. So, to explain our pull incentive that you may have heard about, essentially, if you've got this market failure, we've got labs coming up with possible targets, we've got SMEs developing drugs, but normally, because you can sell drugs, novel drugs that make a difference for quite a lot of money, the big pharma will buy them, they'll do the final clinical trials, they'll commercialise, and they've got supply chains. That isn't happening because the big companies make a loss on them. So the pull incentive is to try and make it attractive, but not a big profit, cover the costs. So what we did was NICE, working with the York Health Economics team and the NHS, looked at valuing antibiotics in a different way from standard NICE procedures. So not just what good does the antibiotic do to the individual, but what good is it protecting that whole ward from catching it, from keeping that person either at school or in the workforce, for protecting our community as an insurance policy on the shelf in the pharmacy. And they came up with values. And what they did was run a procurement and say, we will put 2 drugs, antibiotics, into our pilot of this new valuation scheme. To get into it, you have to have good environmental manufacturing, good stewardship plans, and it's got to be something that matters to our patients because of disease burden. And we will value them and give up to £10 million a year as a subscription for the next 10 years, up to. So depending on what the valuation is. So what the NHS is doing, it's Cofidoricol and ceftazidime with avibactam. One belongs to Shionogi, the other to Pfizer, and they have now contracted. So they get paid for 10 years. Both of them are getting 10 million, as a matter of fact, I think. And it doesn't matter how much is used. So that it can sit on the shelf and not be used and not drive resistance. And it's really worked. Everyone's happy, and the evidence was all produced. The Germans have got some new reimbursement model. Sweden's got an access pilot. And actually, in the US, they've got, and we hope they pass it before Christmas, but I'm beginning to worry about it, a Pasteur Act, which would put $6 billion, dollars, but they're much the same these days, $6 billion over the next 5 years into a subscription model modelled on ours. And now, I was told by Steve Powis, the medical director of the NHS, we're going to integrate this into our standard procurement for 1 or 2 new antibiotics a year with a simpler assessment too. So we got that moving, and the G7 is working on it. We also got the health ministers agreeing the principles by which you would value these. But to get it to work, we need all the G7 and most of the G20 to join in with pull mechanisms. So it's good. We also got G7 to commit to looking much more at the environmental side and thinking about international standards and everything, but it doesn't seem to be moving forward as much as it should be. The other thing we believe, or I believe very strongly, is we must have surveillance that gives us data of what's going on, and it needs to be openly accessible. And I persuaded George Osborne, and we've managed to keep it going, to give us 265 million of official development assistance, ODA, and it hasn't been cut, for the Fleming Fund, which is working in 21 countries, helping people develop their labs, develop their data, use it to push policy locally and nationally in their countries. And this morning, part of that is Fleming Fellows, who are young people early in their career getting trained in all of this and how to use the data, empowered and taught how to talk to politicians. I graduated and gave certificates on Zoom, actually, to I think 45 of them. It's very exciting. I am on the UN Global Leaders Group. It's chaired by Prime Minister Motley of Barbados. You will have seen how wonderful she is at COP and all sorts of things. And the Prime Minister from Bangladesh, another woman. And what we're trying to do is get everyone to take what's known as a One Health approach. That is, I find One Health is too difficult to explain it, but it's integrated. It's saying whatever you do in the food chain impacts the environment and humans. So for food security, you've got to think about how you use antibiotics. Ditto humans and what's going on in the environment. Did you know that citrus crops in Florida and California are sprayed with streptomycin? Yeah, you're a medical audience. You are as horrified as I am. We are negotiating as countries at the WHO for a new instrument or treaty about pandemics. I have, on behalf of the Global Leaders Group, been presenting to those who are writing the zero draft, and we've just seen it, and I've got it in, trying to persuade them that AMR is the silent pandemic and must be mentioned in it, the One Health bit must be there, and that we need equitable access to anything that comes out. But what is needed for pandemics of every sort, including AMR, is surveillance. So I use the metaphor of we need the lights on the Christmas tree all the time working, and that's for AMR, but the minute you get something else happening, you can pivot and make the lights flash as you do other things. And we've got to do this multi-sectoral approach, because, as I said, 80% of the antibiotics are in humans. Actually, let me just tell you so that you feel good about it. New data that came out a couple of weeks ago shows that sales of veterinary antibiotics in the UK is at its lowest ever recorded figure. And since 2014, we've had an 83% decrease in sales of antibiotics for animals, which are of critical importance in human health. And the poultry, they've managed voluntarily to reduce antibiotics by 90%. When I was CMO, I got a visit from the head of the National Farming Union. She said, I never thought I'd come and see a CMO, but I want to say thank you that you've been going around the world describing our work and how healthy and happy our animals are without antibiotics. It remains our intention to strengthen the national law in this year, including in this area, including about prophylaxis. But what I began to learn was you can do stuff bottom up, you can, in a health service, the food chain, you can do policy top down, but actually, if we really want to move the dial, we need two other things. So the first is, I thought we shouldn't underestimate the role of investors and industry. So, through consumer pressure, mainly in the States, McDonald's, you never thought you'd hear me say something good about McDonald's, announced a policy to eliminate the use of highest priority critically important antibiotics, defined by the WHO, by 2027 in their chickens. Shake Shack, for one, has a sign saying we use antibiotics rarely and responsibly type of thing. So they're using them, but we've got to kind of keep this going and make it accelerate. People are interested in the ethics of their food, so we need to act. And actually, my students at Trinity College, we have an endowment. So they decided they would do what students do of activist climate investing. And with our permission, I had to go to council and explain what they were going to do. They've been off to some of the AGMs where we invest in them, demanding action on AMR. So they went to the AGM of Yum, the parent company of KFC, McDonald's and Pizza Hut. And though others joined in, so we only got, I think, 12.5% of the vote, Yums could see what was coming, and they've committed to producing a report on the use of antibiotics in all their supply chains. So youth, investors, we have to use all of this, and I hope you're going to join with us and get others to take a stand. We also, from the UK, launched an Investor Action on AMR initiative alongside an NGO fair, PRI and Access to Medicines, and we've got 15 investors so far with a collective asset portfolio of over 11 trillion who've signed up, and they've put AMR and good use of antibiotics into their ESG criteria. But, you know, everyone's got to join in. There's so much more, and this is a bit like climate change. Every time I lift a stone up, I find another issue about AMR. I find more complication. And because it doesn't really have a face, we haven't got youth onto it and things on it as we should do. So we've tried something new. And it's rather fun. So I was in Washington about 3-4 weeks ago at the first night of a real out-of-the-box solution. We staged the musical The Mold That Changed the World. It was a sellout for 6 nights in Washington, a sellout for 6 nights in Atlanta. It's using the story, the life history of Fleming with professional soloists and a community choir who then get to sing about IPC, they get to sing about AMR and deaths, and then it moves on to deaths. And by marrying the arts and scientists, we're getting new audiences and movement for change. And they also went in Washington to the National Children's Hospital and did a children's version. So we hope we can raise some more money to take that to other places. And I really want to take it to the UN General Assembly, because in 2024 we'll have a high-level meeting on AMR, and this is a way of galvanizing civil society. We need to do much more at the UN level and at the grassroots. So I would argue that we've got this very short window to grow or build on post-COVID, where we're talking about equity and access, before we slide back into some of the old ways of working. And it's very important that we work together to realise our vision of a world free of drug-resistant infections. And I hope you're all going to join in, because, frankly, it needs you. And we should do it for our grandchildren. This is another intergenerational problem where we have used all the antibiotics, and the poor countries have got a massive problem, and our children, if we don't sort it, are going to inherit a massive problem. So let me end there, again by saying how honoured I am to receive this award and how lovely it is to be here with all of you. Thank you. Oh,
yeah. And you make a profound important point at the end. I mean, you've linked this with global warming. One of the tragedies of global warming is that the richer countries woken up to this. We've polluted the world, and we say, well, we're now not going to pollute the world as much. And the poorer countries saying, yeah, but we can't afford to do this. Is it going to be the same here?
well, I hope not. if we can get the pull incentives right, then we will have paid for the drugs, actually. Then we can do tiered pricing. What will be important is to put in place access and stewardship. But J&J have done not a bad job with Badalaquin for multi-drug resistant and extreme drug resistant TB. So I think it can be done.
For anybody here who's not read The Stain on Dr. Flory's Coat, do, because although Alexander Fleming quite rightly gets a lot of the credit, finding something by accident is one thing, actually making it work as a drug is another.
True.
And for those who don't understand AMR, the first person, the police officer, who pricked his finger on a rose, became ill, was given antibiotics, the first penicillin patient ever, and he got so much better. And then 3 days later, he relapsed. They didn't have any more penicillin, and he died. And it's just extraordinary to think what our lives would be like if we didn't have the sort of drugs we do have that worked. Now, questions. We've got some time. Anybody wants to? Yeah, Alan.
I'll take the mic if somebody
Sorry?
wants to ask. I'll take the mic round if somebody wants to ask.
Please.
Questions?
Roger.
Thank you very much indeed. That was mostly new to me, and I feel rather embarrassed about that fact. One thing I wanted to ask you is, there are quite a few countries around the world where you can walk into a pharmacy and buy antibiotics over the counter. How big a deal is that, and what could be done to change that?
Well, it's absolutely ghastly. You've put your hand on or mind to one of our big problems. Not only can they buy them over the counter, so they may be doing a coffee, shall I call it, I'm on film. Using them when they maybe don't need them, but about 50% of them will be counterfeit. Usually the counterfeit ones have very low levels, so that drives more resistance. And many of the people who buy them can only afford 1 day or 2 days rather than a full course. That drives resistance. So the whole thing is a nightmare. I just got a grant from the Wellcome Trust for £3 million to run a challenge. In 2020, I set up a charity called the Trinity Challenge, and I raised £7.5 million, and we ran a global challenge about how to use data better to predict, diagnose and manage pandemics better. We got 340 applications from 62 countries, and the 8 winners are just amazing what they're doing. And the Wellcome have given me money to do a challenge working on AMR in low and middle income countries, collecting data, different ways of collecting data that isn't hospital data and can be One Health. And actually one of the things I think which would be fun would be to use phones and take pictures of the antibiotics, because then you'd know what was there, the consumption, the sales, which is probably equivalent to consumption, and you'd begin to get a feel for what was going on in a way that we don't have. But if you don't have doctors and chemists, how can you regulate it? It's very difficult. Our ministers would like to put antibiotics into chemists and let them do it. And actually, I'm not totally against it, but I think we need the randomised controlled trial, and so it has been designed, because I've been saying we need one. And what you need is a limited number of pharmacists who work through the algorithm that actually the GPs use, and can look at a point-of-care test, perhaps a procalcitonin or something, and then prescribe. They might be better than a lot of GPs. So I'm not against it, but if it's done properly, but we need to do the randomised controlled trial. And it isn't just about, oh dear, you want some antibiotics, here you are, that'll be £5, madam, you know.
Dan?
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for your address. Do you think the internet has made matters worse with regard to sales of antibiotics, which can go pretty much anywhere? And I have a second point, if I may. I'm the editor of the Medico-Legal Journal, and we've become very international recently, well, in the last few years. And I had an article sent to me, which we will be publishing, about prescription in this country of antibiotics and other drugs. And I don't know if you would agree with this, but the writer said that we have now 1/3 of practicing doctors in this country who did not qualify in this country. And prescribing governance is much weaker in many other countries, and they often come from countries where there is weak prescribing governance. And they bring with them the views that they learned when they trained. And so therefore there is some weakness in the way they prescribe drugs as well. And there is concern about that. So I wondered if you had a view on that.
I think there can be concern. Why do I like evidence-based medicine? Because you should follow science, but it also means it's a way of keeping up to date, because if you don't, the evidence is the doctors practice as they were taught when they were medical students in the first couple of years. So there is a risk. Of course, we have pharmacy advisors around the country, and our chief pharmacist and the community team in NHS England do a lot with those pharmacists, and we have managed to reduce community prescribing of antibiotics by, I think it's 13%. So yet people are getting more complex diseases and older. So I think that's quite good. We've also managed to keep it stable in hospitals until COVID. And that, considering the increasing throughputs, complexity and everything, isn't bad, though I wish we could do better. So there's way to go, but I think the pharmacy advisors are the way that we really change activity. Though, of course, we did a behavioural trial some years ago when I was CMO, and the top 25% of GP prescribers of antibiotics got a letter. Half of them got a letter from me. They were randomised as CMO saying, you should know you're in the top 25% of prescribers. And it did generate an interesting postbox of, you don't know what you're talking about, you know. And we had a nice letter. No, we're not complaining. We're just highlighting. And we do understand about complexity and age and all of that. But actually, prescribing went down quite a lot. Then it came up, but it stayed down. Then we did it again, and it came down again. The Australian CMO copied it and got it to go down vastly, but they had been dramatically over-prescribing. So you can do behavioural interventions as well with the GPs and other people, which was quite fun.
So what happened to the other arm? You said you did a...
Well, we compared them, and so the letter that went out, the people who got the letter reduced compared to the other arm. It wasn't a placebo. I don't remember a placebo. Hey, aren't you nice? Yes. Sorry, you asked me something else. What?
Oh, the internet.
Yes, I do worry about internet purchase, and it is an issue, and MHRA do their best to clamp down on it, but it is quite tough. Yeah.
Anyone else? Yes.
Caroline?
Running on from that, I do know somebody who gets a lot of chest infections and his GP refuses him antibiotics and he goes to a private GP solely for antibiotics. He has very little money, but that's how he spends a lot of it. And I don't know how widespread this phenomenon is, but it seems to me a bad thing, and that the private GP is presumably fairly unregulated. Am I right in thinking this?
I suspect the private GP is not being advised by a pharmacy advisor, yes. It is of concern, yeah. And the trouble is, you know, if you have viral infections or just some inflammation, the natural history is it will get better. So if you give people antibiotics, they often think it's the antibiotic that made them better rather than, hey, that was going to happen anyway. That's why we do RCTs.
I thought it was all the drugs I was getting from Holland and Barrett that were keeping me better, but maybe I was wrong. Anyone else? Yeah, can we get
Hi, yeah, thank you for your talk. I was just wondering, in terms of how we were talking about how there are some, you know, in lower income countries where antibiotics are just sold, or maybe even in the black market, or the antibiotics. How much of dealing with that do you think is actually targeting the sellers, and how much of it is actually targeting the people, misinformation within the public on how antibiotics work. Because oftentimes when people have viral infections, they might still, say, let me get an antibiotic and that will cure it or whatever. How much do you think lies within educating the public compared to actually targeting the sellers themselves?
I think there's a number of issues. The first is at the customs, how is it that counterfeit are getting in? So how porous are their borders? What are they doing? And that comes back to customs and regulation of medicines. Then there's why are they not prescribed, because that would be the right thing to do and they shouldn't be available over the counter. Then there is, and what advice can people get? But in some of these countries I've visited, I can see that there is no one to ask and they just believe it will help them. I think it's tragic because they can buy injections and things like that, and it really is driving the resistance in their countries, which will spill over to us. But people are dying. I mean, it is safer in many low-income countries to give birth outside the medical facilities because of the risks of infection. One piece of data I saw was that in India, 60,000 newborns every year die of untreatable sepsis.
Yes. Sorry, is it current? No. Please.
Thank you. Well, I should declare an interest because nearly 50 years ago I was a medical rep selling antibiotics, and we had very good training at the time and we learned all about beta-lactamase and all this stuff. But I remember having a thought at the time as I went through the training, these drugs are only really operating at a fairly superficial level. They're not going into what actually generates the surface proteins and all this sort of stuff. Are there, and I'm not up to date with this at all now, of course, I'm long retired, but are there avenues of research that are likely to make AMR less likely to develop?
Well, yes, and there are some quite exciting opportunities, but what I was trying also to explain is because of the market failure, we're losing those opportunities at the moment because the companies go out of business. There's one company called Entasis, and it was all the antibiotics work of AstraZeneca spun out, and it was doing some really good work. It's got a fabulous looking anti-gonorrhea drug, which we badly need for the world. And they went public and shares were sold for quite a lot. And now their shares are worth nothing, yet the drug is still a good drug, but they can't afford to develop it. We've been funding it through a public route. So yes, there are exciting opportunities, but the money isn't there to do it. They get the money from cancer drugs.
One maybe last question, and since I've got the microphone, I'm going to ask it. One of the things from COVID may have been that some countries that maybe didn't have great monitoring of viruses and microbial stuff, their labs must have increased, their capacity must have increased, and their knowledge must have increased hugely over the last couple of years. Does that stand them in better stead for the next pandemic?
It will, if they continue with the bacteria and the AMR analyses and they continue to fund them. But a lot of these poor countries, COVID's gone. Right. Of course it hasn't gone, but there we are. Yeah. Not as good a story as I'd like to tell you. Thank you.
Sally, thank you very, very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Dame Sally Davies. Thank you so much. Very wonderful. Wonderful. For those of you watching online, before those of us here tuck into some rather fine wines and some splendid food, just a thought, a question to everybody here. Sally was talking about sending out some letters and doing a trial, a randomized trial, because half the people didn't get the letter, or if they did, there were letters about something else. So they had a treatment arm and another arm. I'm just wondering, can you think of any area of public policy, any area at all, that would not benefit from randomized trials? a question I posed for dinner. Anyway, Sally, thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for being here and those of you for watching. Bye-bye.